high because we work with more than just government employers who your situation is that typically coverage is offered to everybody that it should at a fairly low cost, and there's maybe not as many people slipping through the cracks and not being offered insurance. But there are some employers we work with that we would expect some amount of penalty to happen. So I think we're still waiting and wanting to see what that process looks like. What we do know is that any penalties that will be assessed are going to be based on these forms, these 1095 and 1094C forms that the employer provides. The trigger for whether or not a company can get penalized is if the employee that was full-time and maybe not offered coverage or not offered affordable coverage, if they are to actually go out and get subsidized insurance. So there's another form that gets involved that isn't the responsibility of the employer. So that would be the 1095A, which is what that employee would be receiving if they have coverage through the exchange. So we do expect to see those penalties soon, and when those penalties are starting to first show up for an employer, there is going to be an appeal process where the employer can say, no, I don't think that particular employee should cause us any penalty. And so there will be an iterative process where you almost get kind of an initial billing for that employer mandate penalty and have a chance to respond, and then there will be kind of a final billing of that penalty. That is going to be a separate process from what we did start to see last year during 2016, which was an opportunity for employers to appeal marketplace notices. So there were notices that were starting to be sent out during 2016, and this is expected to be an ongoing thing going forward for employers to have the right to appeal the determination that a particular employee of theirs is able to get subsidized insurance through the exchange. And we'll spend a little bit more time on that on the next slide. So I'm going to table that piece. Just wanted to add one more item on this particular page, is that these employer mandate penalties, they're not like other penalties that we've seen through the IRS that need to be discovered either through audit or through somebody with knowledge of a potential penalty informing of the IRS that's out there so that they can perform an audit. These are going to be an automatic type of situation, again, based on those 1090 and 1095C forms that employer is filling out. In a sense, you're self-reporting when you might have any potential for a penalty. Okay, so going back to those exchange notices, because that's something that we saw get a lot of focus last year as employers make that decision. Do I need to respond to this notice? I've got somebody out there has identified us as the employer, and so now the HHS or these marketplace notices are getting sent out to me as the employer, saying that I have a right to appeal that decision. The first piece is that this is a separate process from any actual penalty that the employer could receive through the employer mandate provisions of the Affordable Care Act, and not appealing in these situations does not take away your rights to appeal later if you were to get penalized for an employee that you don't think you should get penalized on. So a good example of this would be you have somebody who does work for you, but they're only working 20 hours a week, and so they go out and get subsidized insurance if they're not getting offered coverage through the employer. Well, that's an employee that you're now aware that they have applied and are getting subsidized insurance, but you're not needing to appeal that decision because you have no reason to say that employee shouldn't be getting subsidized insurance because you're not offering them coverage yourself. Now, that's still a situation, though, where you wouldn't be expected to get a penalty for that particular employee because they are not meeting the full-time levels under the Affordable Care Act. They're not working 30 hours a week. They're a 20-hour-a-week employee. So if the IRS were to try to penalize you for that particular employee at some future date, then you would still have your rights to appeal that particular decision. So these are separate processes, and one appeal does not impact the other. So some employers are choosing to not go through those. I do think it's beneficial if you have an employee, though, that was offered coverage that meets all the definitions of affordability, to go ahead and go through that appeal process. And part of that is that it's a benefit to the employee. So that last bullet here on this page has kind of two potential benefits. One, if that employee is then found later to have coverage that means that it shouldn't have gotten subsidized insurance, say they have coverage, it does meet the affordability definitions, then they could potentially have to repay any exchange subsidies they've received to that point. So getting out in front of it and appealing at that point can be a help to the particular employee in question. The other is, as we talked about on the prior page, the trigger for any penalties is somebody going out and getting subsidized insurance. So if you can preclude a particular employee from even receiving that subsidized insurance, then you have less chances of any potential trigger for a penalty. So in cases where you are offering coverage that does meet the affordability definitions, it's still probably a good idea to go through that appeal notice, even though it doesn't impact you directly from a penalty standpoint. And so then, just a refresher, as we look forward and employers are wanting to avoid penalties, there's two main pieces to doing so. The first is that an offer of coverage needs to be made, and we're told that they need to have an effective opportunity to enroll or decline on that coverage every year. So the open enrollment process takes care of that. There were some employers that haven't had an open enrollment for quite a while. I doubt anybody that's on this call fits under that scenario, but that's the situation that really is being addressed with needing to offer the coverage at least once every year, to have that opportunity to decline. And I'm not getting into kind of whether or not the coverage meets minimum value and is considered minimum essential coverage, but that's part of all this. So there's kind of the assumption in my first bullet there that the plans that you're offering are meeting the minimum essential coverage requirements and minimum value, and I know that for ISAC plans that is the case. The second piece then is not just was the offer of coverage made, but what does it cost the employee? So there are affordability safe harbors where the employee or the employer can know that they're safe if they're offering their employees a lowest cost single rate plan that meets one of these three different safe harbors, and those are the W-2 wages. So looking at what that lowest cost monthly plan. So if you have multiple options, you just pick the one that has the lowest cost. That's the threshold that we're comparing on. And is that a low enough amount in relation to their W-2 wages? So that first safe harbor requires that we know what their W-2 wages are for the year. So it's a safe harbor that's a little harder to use because you won't know what that W-2 number is for most of your employees until the year's over. And at that point, you're going to be a little bit rushed. If you're in a situation where your premiums are sufficiently low, then there would be probably no concern because you're not expecting that you need to be running reports to find out who doesn't meet this particular safe harbor. But if your premiums are sufficiently low, then one of these other two options is probably a better choice. And those are the rate of pay. So here we're looking at either their hourly rate or their monthly base salary amount. And we can base affordability on those and know prospectively whether or not a particular employee is going to have affordable coverage. And then finally, if your premiums are low enough that you can use this last safe harbor, it's probably considered to be the strongest of all of them because it doesn't depend on that particular employee's actual paid amounts or rate of pay, and that's basing it on the federal poverty line. We'll get into on a future slide exactly kind of what percentages to use here, but the law was all written with a 9.5%. So that's kind of the background that we bring into this. So if you're looking at a federal poverty line and your premiums were about $95 or less, then you would probably be able to use that. And the federal poverty line is saying you look at that federal poverty rate, or what that amount is for the year. 2016, that was $11,880. Take that divided by 12 and multiply it by this affordability percentage. And if your premiums are less than that amount, then you would know you were safe using this federal poverty line safe harbor. So we kind of listed these in weakest to strongest, and the reason is just how much effort is there on your end. The W-2 is the weakest because it requires you to both look at that individual employee and wait until the year is over before you can know. Rate of pay is a little bit stronger because you don't need to wait until the end of the year. You can know just based on their hourly rate or their monthly salary amount. And then the federal poverty line being the strongest because it doesn't require any knowledge of that particular employee. It only requires knowledge of how much is your lowest cost single premium for the employees. And then there is a bit of a disconnect in the safe harbors that are available to the employer to know that you're safe from penalty and how these subsidies are actually going to be awarded. Subsidies are awarded based on household income. So in theory, somebody could have affordable coverage through their employer and still qualify for subsidized insurance through the exchange if their household income was low enough, because those affordability safe harbors don't take into account all of the details of the household, such as how many members are in the household, and that can have an impact on whether they can get subsidized insurance.
Michael, before you move on, we had a question. If you can go back one slide.
Okay.
Could you repeat the federal poverty line amount?
Sure. For 2016, that number was $11,880. All right.
All right. Thank you.
Yep. I guess I'll just quickly do a little calculation on that. So monthly, that would be $990, and then actually, as we flip to this next page, we'll keep that amount in mind, and we'll readdress that for one little piece at the end here. So there was a notice that came out last December, notice 2015-87, and it clarifies a question that we all had last year: is do we need to stay to a strict 9.5% when we're doing these calculations for whether the coverage is affordable? And the answer that we got was the answer we were hoping for, and the answer is no. We can use the same indexed amount that is being used on the household income side if they were to go out and try to get subsidized insurance. So for plan years that began in 2015, the threshold amount was 9.56%. It's not a big difference from the 9.5%, but it is that little bit higher amount. And for 2016, that's 9.66%. So if we go back to that $990 a month under the 2016 federal poverty level, and we multiply that by 9.66%, we get $95.63. So if your lowest cost single premium is $95.63 or less, then you would be okay to use the federal poverty line safe harbor for affordability, and you wouldn't have to go and look at anybody's income on their own merits. You don't have to look at their hourly rate or the W-2 amount. What does that 9.66% versus 9.5% get you? If you're going to try to charge the maximum amount and still want to use the federal poverty line, then as an illustration, you could charge your employees an extra $19 over the course of the entire year. So it's not a big deal. It means your premiums could be about $1.50 and a little bit of change higher than they would if the IRS had stuck to a strict 9.5% amount. So it's not a big amount, but if you happen to fall in that threshold and your premiums are exactly $95 a month, then this is very good news for you because it means you can use that federal poverty line affordability safe harbor. All right. Then now the due dates. So as we moved into 2017 here, and we're looking at reporting for 2016, we started to say, well, last year we had a lot of time to do this. They made some increases, and they allowed us to have until the end of March to get employees the forms, till the end of May if you were sending the IRS forms by mail, or the end of June if you were sending the IRS forms electronically. So as we moved into this year, the expectation was it's going to look a lot more like W-2 reporting, and that's what you'll see for the dates listed here. That your forms 1095C, 1095B as well, but that won't be those aren't forms completed by the employer, but those are forms that you're probably familiar with, because ISAC is sending out their information about who is covered for which months via this 1095B form. And then the employer forms are the 1095C. So those forms to employees are due by the end of January, although since September, when we initially were preparing all of these slides, they have made a change, and they have extended that. So there was a 30-day extension that could be requested, and that 30-day extension was given to everybody across the board for this year. So you don't have to go out and request any extensions for 2016 forms. You have until March 2nd of 2017 to provide those to the employees, and that's via this notice 2016-70. No further extensions are being awarded. At least that's the stated status quo for this notice, is that this extension is what would normally happen. It's the same process as if you were to apply for that individually. So you can't go out and apply individually and get an additional 30-day extension. So March 2nd is the date you really want to keep in mind and have those employee forms sent out by then. Then providing forms to the IRS. If you're filing on paper, which would require that you have less than 250 forms to file, then you need to do that by the end of February. So obviously, you'd probably want to have your employee forms on the bullet above done a little bit beforehand, so that you're still able to send those out to the IRS by mail. And if you're filing electronically, then you have until the end of March. So all of that, I think, should look very similar to W-2s and the W-3 process for providing those forms to the IRS. Then we get to a question that doesn't probably impact a lot of you directly, but it does have some pieces to it that are interesting for counties. So here we're looking at the aggregated ALE groups. What this is there are companies that are out there that are commonly owned, where they have enough common ownership that the IRS will say they all need to comply with these employer mandating requirements, regardless how big any one individual company is. So this is part of the rules that were put in place when the ACA 50 life groups, that there was that, well, what's going to keep some companies from splitting into multiple 49 employee groups? And this is part of the avenue towards that based on common ownership, those all get combined to see if they're big enough to have these employer mandating laws applied to them. And if they are, they will still have to do the reporting and potentially get penalized. So for counties, this could come into play, although I think it would be fairly rare that there would be any common ownership between a county and another group. You should probably talk to your attorneys to verify if that's the case, if you have any situations that you're concerned about. But we do occasionally hear of cases where counties are offering insurance to employees of other groups, whether it be maybe a waterworks or an extension office that is within the county. Those employees get coverage through the county's plan, and the question is, what's our obligation in those cases? So under that case, you should probably verify again that you don't make up an aggregated ALE group. But even if you do, if they're under separate employer identification numbers, the reporting will happen separately. It would just be a question of whether or not on the 1094-C you would be identifying yourself as part of one of these aggregated groups, which means multiple employers, commonly owned, for ACA reporting will be tied together. And if you are, then you would identify who that other employer is on the last page of the 1094-C, which is asking for the employer identification number. Each employer would still be providing forms separately, so you would not be needing to provide a 1095-C for the employee of any other employer, even if they are offered coverage through your plan. If you were self-insured, then you would provide some potential reporting for them, but if you're part of these ISAC plans, then you wouldn't. However, the process when ISAC is sending out their 1095-Bs, that employee of the other employer will be receiving a 1095-B that says that they had coverage and identifying which month they had coverage in, but that won't be the responsibility of the county. So that's probably the place where this applies most for counties is those situations where you have other employers in the county that might be taking advantage of using insurance that's offered through that same county plan. If you did get to the point where you did think that you were part of an ALE group, the notes on this slide do apply that you still do your own reporting. You only include the employees that fall under your employment, and the other group will do their own. No authoritative transmittal happens at the aggregated ALE group level. The authoritative transmittal is just to tell the IRS that you as an employer have provided all of the reporting that you need, and to give them those kind of final statistics that they're filled out on that authoritative transmittal, the 1095-C, which we'll jump into a little bit more. Then we get into something that there was a little confusion last year, and I think rightfully so. This is what happens if you need to make a correction on the returns. So this is going to happen. Occasionally a form will get filled out. We're going to find out that it needs to be corrected. I think last year the thought was, well, there's a nice box, especially on the 1095-C, that says this is a corrected return. I should probably use that box. And it turns out it's a little bit more complicated than that. So starting at the top, for a Form 1094-C, the only time that you would need to send a corrected authority or a corrected 1094-C is if it was the actual authoritative transmittal. So the authoritative transmittal is probably, for most employers, the only transmittal they make. They gather all of their 1095-Cs, they submit their 1094-C with all of their 1095-Cs at once, and they just do kind of a one-step process. So when they do that, they'll select on line 19 of the 1094-C that yes, this is the authoritative transmittal, and at that point there will be further information that needs to get filled out. How many forms are you attaching to this 1094-C? What then? I guess what certifications of eligibility are you using? So that's line 22, which causes a lot of confusion, and we'll get to in a future slide. Whether or not you're part of an ALE group, which we kind of already discussed. And then there's a part 3 to that form that's going to require some counts of how many employees you have, both full-time and in total, in columns B and C, whether or not minimum essential coverage was offered in column A, and then there's column D and E that have some more special use situations. All of that information is filled out on the authoritative transmittal, and if any of that needs to be corrected, then a new authoritative transmittal would need to be filled out, and that's when you would use the corrected box for a 1094-C. For a 1095-C, there's really two different situations that can happen. You can find a 1095 that needs to be corrected, and it could be a file that had already been sent to the IRS, or a file that was not sent to the IRS but was previously furnished to a recipient. So those are two different situations, and that's where the confusion came in most of the time last year. If the file had already been submitted to the IRS via a 1094-C, then that's when the corrected box should actually be used. So you can think of that corrected box on the 1095-C as only needing to be used when it's official and it's a correction that the IRS is being updated. And if that's the case, you would make that correction. If you have multiple, you do as many as you need, and then you would resubmit those to the IRS with a 1094-C. The 1094-C should not be an authoritative transmittal 1094-C, and it should just be a 1094-C that is used to transmit those corrected forms to the IRS. And in fact, in a lot of cases, you might have some minor corrections, and you don't need to resend that authoritative transmittal with those counts that we talked about, the total number of employees and the full-time employees and such. You're just providing the IRS with those new 1095-C forms, which maybe you just needed to update one of the safe harbor codes, for instance. So that's the case when you would use that checkbox and officially provide the IRS with that update. If it's a form that you catch after you send it to the employee, but prior to submitting it to the IRS, then you don't need to use that corrected checkbox. We're told to just type or print corrected on the new form that you send to the recipient. Now, that is sufficiently vague as to where should you write it. Do you just write it as kind of a watermark across the form? Do you write it in with the name? I think that it is probably left to you as the employer choosing to do something that you consider reasonable. And it could just be as simple as getting out that red pen and writing corrected somewhere on that form before you go and send it to the employee. And then since that form had not already previously been sent to the IRS, you just send the IRS the correct form, and you don't have to mark that corrected box. Right? So then we get into which employees do I need to be sending the 1095-C forms to. The top bullet with its two sub-bullets here is really the focus of this particular group today, that since your plans are through the ISAC or through these ISAC plans, you're not considered to be a self-insured employer, so that second bullet does not really apply to you. But I wanted for completeness to put that in here. So first is, who do I send a form to? It's any employee who is identified as full-time for any month during the calendar year. So remember, with the Affordable Care Act, we have two different methods for identifying who those full-time employees are. You can use a look-back measurement method. That's that process that we look at a standard measurement period, some period of hours that have already happened, evaluate them, and determine if an employee will be considered full-time for a future stability period. We went through that in detail at the seminar last year. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that now, but if there are questions on that, you can feel free to reach out through Brad or to myself directly, or probably better work with whoever you're using for your ACA reporting. Since that method has its complications, a lot of times it's done in conjunction with some other reporting technology. And so I assume that that's probably the case for most of you in the room that are using that particular method. The other method is the monthly measurement method, and this says if they work 130 hours during the month, then for that particular month they are considered a full-time employee. It's a simpler method, but as you can probably guess, it has its downfalls as well, because how do you know which employees are full-time so that you can offer them coverage if you're waiting until the end of the month to find out which ones had 130 hours? So it's not the best method out there if it's an employee who you're not sure if they're full-time or not, and you're wanting to avoid penalty in all situations. But those are the two basic types of methods for how to identify who your full-time employees are. And the main point for the 1095-C is anybody who does get identified as full-time for at least 1 month during the calendar year needs to be receiving a 1095-C from you, the employer. Now, the second bullet, if you're self-insured, then you could also use the 1095-C to provide information about which months employees had coverage. And this would apply because remember, if you're self-insured, then you're considered the coverage provider, and you need to be offering, or you need to be providing reporting showing them which months they had coverage. And sometimes those might not be people who were your full-time employees. So this is helpful even for the group that we're talking to today, because we want to talk about what about COBRA participants or retirees. And here it falls under 2 separate cases. Since you're not self-insured, you don't have to provide reporting for those people unless they were full-time for at least 1 month during the year that we're looking at. So if somebody retired or had elected COBRA insurance and was on your plan under those situations, but they retired or elected COBRA during the year, then they're going to have some months where they were full-time prior to that retirement or that termination where they took the COBRA rate or the COBRA plan. If that's the case, then you will need to provide reporting for them because they were full-time for you for some months of the year. But if they were from a prior year, that they were either a retiree who had been on the plan and retired in 2015 or earlier, or even if they're COBRA and they were on the plan from a prior year, even though they were on your plan during 2016, they were never full-time at any point. And since you don't have a self-insured plan, you would have no obligation to be providing that person a 1095-C. Now, again, ISAC will be sending that person a 1095-B, saying that they had coverage for some months during the year, but you as an employer would have no obligation if they were never employed by you during 2016 as we're getting ready for this reporting. Okay, now moving into the nitty-gritty of the forms themselves. We'll go through line 22 on the 1094-C. This is a line that gets a lot of questions, and then we'll also go through some changes that were made from 2015 to 2016. So that's where our focus will be for the rest of the presentation, and then at the end we'll go through some examples of the coding and look at kind of some of the most common scenarios. A lot of those are going to be repeats if you were in the seminar last year, so it'll be just us coming at it from a year later and hopefully getting better at it and remembering more of what this looks like, and hopefully be a good refresher as you're getting ready to complete your forms here for 2016. So for line 22 of 1094-C, and this is probably the box that I got the most questions on last year. Part of it is that it's confusing in the way that it's written, and it makes it look like in some cases, and it's not necessarily the IRS form itself. A lot of times it was the software provider. As they put together their packages and they asked questions on this, they made it look like one of 2 things or maybe both. A, they made it look like you have to pick one of these, and that's not the case. You could have lots of situations where none of these boxes applied during 2015 or 2016. And so that caused confusion when it was being asked in a way that made employers feel like they were doing something wrong if they weren't selecting at least one of these. The other was that often it was presented as it was limited to just one of these options, and that's not the case either. So for these particular boxes, you can select all that apply, and there's no requirement to select any of them. So it causes confusion because a lot of times our software isn't built in a way that wants to allow those kinds of situations where you can run the gamut of having no boxes checked to having all the boxes checked. And so with that, we have the same 4 boxes this year. The big difference, obviously, is that box B is now reserved. It's no longer in use for 2016. This makes sense because it was a 2015 only box. It was for transition relief that was only available for the 2015 calendar year. So that box is going away. The box C is kind of in limbo or in transition. This is also a transition relief, but it was assigned to the plan year. So if the plan year that began in 2015 still has months remaining during 2016, this particular box could still be used for 2016. Now, this is the transition relief that gave relief from penalty. So for smaller employers that were in that 50 to 99 full-time equivalent range, those employers had kind of a year free of penalty for this first year, this first transition year. So that was very important for people of that size. They were using this box C just to make sure, even in cases where they didn't think they had any penalties. This was kind of a get out of jail free card for any penalties for 2015 plan years. So if your plan year began in May, you can still use this for box C. What you do then is you check this box, and then this box requires a further entry on part 3 of the 1094-C, which is the second page of that form. And off to the far right, there's a column E. And for the months that are assigned to that 2015 plan year, you would use the code A if this was the situation that you're in. If you were that 50 to 99 full-time equivalent employer who wasn't going to get penalized for the 2015 plan year, and you had a renewal in May, as we talked about, then you would be able to use this code A in column E for January, February, March, and April, and that would signify to the IRS that no penalties could happen for you during those 4 months, even if you did have some potential exposure to penalty. For the remaining months, then it would be left blank. And the other type of transition relief that was out there for last year was that for the larger employers, the 100+ full-time equivalent employees. This required the use of code B in that column E that we talked about. And this probably doesn't interest anybody on the call, because that was only for cases where the employer was going to be assessed a 4980HA penalty, or what we often call it the sledgehammer penalty, which says you did not offer coverage to at least 95% of your full-time employees. And again, with the transition relief for last year, it was that threshold was lowered to 70%. So it would have required you not offering coverage to at least 70% of your full-time employees in order for that potential penalty to get assessed. And that's not the case that we saw, especially for government employers. Okay, so going then to the 2 boxes that we do expect to be around long term, or at least beyond 2017, since box C is expected to now go away next year, since there will be no more use for it. We look at box A and box D. Now, box A is this qualifying offer method. And what a qualifying offer is under the Affordable Care Act is kind of a special type of offer of coverage that combines who's being offered coverage along with how much does that coverage cost from an affordability standpoint. And if you can use it, there is a potential advantage on the 1095-C. And this is a question we do get. So the qualifying offer method says that you're offering coverage to the entire household, and it also says that the coverage that's been offered is affordable using that federal poverty line safe harbor. So if you're offering coverage and you're not limiting it to employees and dependents or anything conditional with spouses, then you could use this if the premium is less than that $95.63 that we talked about. The advantage here is on your offer of coverage code, when we get to the 1095-C, you can use code 1A. If you use code 1A, it's saying that both of those things are true, that the coverage is offered to the entire household. So in that sense, it's equivalent to code 1E. Now, there are a bunch of codes for what kind of offer of coverage you have. The most common is this 1E that says I'm offering coverage and I'm offering it to the entire household. There are no limitations on spouses or dependents in that situation. If you use code 1E, you'd also have to fill out line 15 that identifies what is that lowest cost amount. for a monthly plan. So if it's $20 a month that you charge employees, you would fill out line 15 with $20 underneath that code 1E. If you use line A, you're certifying that the coverage that we provide is at a low enough cost that we can meet that federal poverty line affordability safe harbor, and the IRS is going to allow you then to leave line 15 blank. So it's not the largest advantage in the world, but if you have a whole bunch of rate schedules, say you charge your municipal fire and police people one rate, or I guess for counties, if you charge your sheriff one rate and you charge your general employees another, and maybe you have further breakdowns, then rather than needing to go out and grab each person's individual rate, it might be to your advantage to use this qualifying offer method, use code 1A, and not need to fill out line 15. But if you did so, you'd want to make sure that all of your schedules had a plan that was at least that $95.63 or less that we talked about. So that's one place that I could see this being an advantage, just because there could be a little bit of burden in going and grabbing the right schedule if you have multiple schedules available. Box D is saying that of all the people that are receiving a 1095-C from the county, we're offering coverage to at least 98% of them. So it's basically saying you have very few people that are ever considered full-time and not offered coverage. If that's the case, then the advantage is on your authoritative transmittal, the 1095-C, that column B that asks for what's the full-time employee count, you can leave that blank. So you don't have to go through the process of counting up how many full-time employees you have for each month. You still do need to fill out column C that says how many employees did I have each month, but in some ways that's an easier column to fill out because you can just run based on your payroll software how many, the count of employees I had on a single day of the month, and that's a little bit more straightforward than the process of identifying who your full-time employees are. So that's the advantage to using box D. I assume that probably applies to quite a few people on the call, and that's something that you may want to consider. The reason the IRS allows that is if you're offering to 98% or more of your full-time employees, then you're expected to be safely above that 95% threshold for offering coverage. And the place where the full-time employee count gets used by the IRS is to determine what is your 4980HA penalty or your sledgehammer penalty, because that's a penalty that's based on the total number of full-time employees that you have. And since that penalty could never apply if you're offering to 98% or more of your full-time employees, then if you certify this, they're going to allow you to not provide them with that number so they could properly penalize you under that situation. At least that's my guess as to trying to figure out why they allow some of these certifications. So box A and box D are expected to be around for the long term, and kind of the main takeaway is you don't have to use either. You can use both, or you can use either one. You kind of have all the options available to you in that case. So if your software provider kind of limits you in that way, feel free to push back a little bit. And there we go. I wasn't able to transition slides there for a second, so sorry for the delay. Now, as we look at the changes that have happened in the 2016 reporting, we have these two new lines or two new codes for the offer of coverage code. So as we look towards the changes now on the 1095-C, there are code series 1 codes that are used in line 14 that are saying whether or not an offer of coverage was made for the month and giving further information if needed. So last year, if an employer were to limit the spouse of the employee's coverage based on whether or not that spouse had coverage available elsewhere, then that was still considered to be an offer of coverage to the spouse, and code 1E or 1A was still allowed under those situations. This year, they're now breaking those off into two separate categories. So if the offer of coverage to the spouse is conditional upon that spouse not having coverage elsewhere, then there are these new codes, 1J and 1K. 1J is for use in situations where the spouse coverage is optional and dependents are not offered coverage. That is not something that we would expect to happen very often. But 1K is something that we do see a fair amount of. That this is a case where coverage is offered to the spouse, unless that spouse has their own employer coverage or other caveats on it, then 1K is what would be used there, and the dependents are still allowed to be on the plan for the employer filling out this form. So 1J and 1K are new, and then Code 1I is no longer in use for this year, so they've marked that reserved. That tied to the box that was reserved last, or actually tied to box B that is reserved on the 1094C as well. So that makes sense that would no longer be in case this year. And I think to just avoid confusion, rather than rebranding Code 1I as one of these new codes, they just went ahead and added 2 new codes for this year to give a little bit of time between when they start using that 1I for something else again. So for this year, Code 1I is reserved, and we have these 2 new codes, 1J and 1K. All right, and then for the 2 series codes, these are what we call the safe harbor codes. So these are telling the IRS whether the employer is safe from penalty for a particular month or not. There's another code that got reserved under this situation, and this is tied to that box C that we discussed on line 22 of the 1094C. This is for the months prior to the 2015 plan year that happened during 2015. This was the code saying, I am safe from penalty because the 2015 plan year hasn't began yet, and that's when penalties started for all of this employer mandate reporting. That is no longer needed for this year because those months were only happened during 2015, and there's no need for them. So Code 2I is reserved. No additional safe harbor codes were added this year, so we're still under the same safe harbor codes that we used last year. And with that, we'll go ahead and jump into some examples, and as we do so, I'll do some refreshments of which safe harbor codes we're using and why, as well as which offer coverage codes we're using in each of these situations. So, Brad, does it sound okay to go on, or did you want to hit any questions before we move forward?
There was one question. If you said you could use the 98% offer, which would be box D.
Yeah.
And you said you could use a combination of them, box A, C, and D. If you use the 4980H, which would be box C, as well as box D, could you skip column B on the 1094C, part 3?
Yeah. Yep. You can skip column B, and then column E would require either an A or a B in the months. Now, the piece with that though is only column E, only box or only letter A could apply in that case. So the only time you could ever use C and D in conjunction like this is if you were one of those smaller employers who was in the 50 to 99 full-time equivalent range, because part of what you're certifying in box D is that you're offering coverage to 98% of the people that are receiving a 1095C. And especially for this transition year where we had the higher threshold amount, if you're certifying that you need to use box C and you're a large employer, that's saying that you had a potential sledgehammer penalty, that you were not offering coverage to at least 95% of your full-time employees, and for the months that were part of 2015 plan year, 70% of your full-time employees. So if either of those are true, then you're not offering coverage to 98% of the people receiving a 1095C. So there's a little bit of a disconnect in, for larger employers, this can never happen. But if you're one of those smaller employers in the 50 to 99 range, you could use that box C that says, I'm safe from penalty for the remaining months of my 2015 plan year. And you could also use box D saying, I offer coverage to 98% of my full-time employees, and so I don't need to provide box or column B with a number. Does that make sense?
Okay, so just to recap really quick, so if you have 50 to 99 employees and you use both those boxes, box C and box D, you can skip column B, and then you have to use code A or B in column E.
Yeah, and it'd be code A is the only situation that would make sense for the example.
Okay. Okay, that's the only question we have so far. So.
Okay, great. So we'll kind of start with the most common example, and this would be you have a full-time employee. They were your employee the entire year. And they were offered coverage, and they accepted that coverage. So in this case, we are going to use code 1E that says coverage was offered to the entire household. So some alternatives here are maybe if you're going to use that qualifying offer that we talked about, if you are using box A of the 1095 or 1094C line 22, then you could use code 1A in line 14, which would mean that you could leave line 15 blank. So that's kind of one alternative to consider. And then as well, if you're not offering coverage to the entire household, you'll need to look up what the correct code is, because code 1E would not be the case. But for 99% of cases at this point, 1E is still what's being used. It's saying that the offer of coverage is made to the entire household. If you use code 1E, you'll need to fill out line 15 with what that lowest cost single plan rate was. So here we have a $100 plan in the example. If your lowest cost single plan is $0, you should actually put 0 in line 15 rather than leaving it blank. So line 15 needs to be filled out for codes 1B, 1C, 1D, and 1E, which are all the old codes from last year that tie to whether the entire household was offered or whether some subset. And then also the new codes 1J and 1K, which are those conditional offer of coverages. If you use any of those codes, you'll need to have an amount in line 15. And it's perfectly acceptable to use code 1E with a 0. But if that's your situation, you also have that alternative that we talked about of using code 1A and using the qualifying offer. So the examples I set up, I used kind of the normal method of 1E with an actual amount, but keep in mind that 1A is available, and if you use 1A, then you would leave line 15 blank. And then since this employee accepted the coverage, they're going to use Safe Harbor Code 2C, which says that employee is enrolled in your coverage or enrolled in your plan. And since they're enrolled in your plan, you're safe from penalty, regardless of how much that plan potentially costs. The alternative, in some cases, premiums are going to change at July 1st or some other date throughout the year. If that's the case and they're not the same for all 12 months, you would want to fill out that monthly amount for each month. But the thing to keep in mind for line 15, or actually any of these, is if you use the all 12 months code, please leave January through December all blank. And if you use January through December, then please leave the all 12 months code blank. They don't want you to put 1E kind of in all 13 boxes. They want one of them to be blank, either the individual months to be blank or the all 12 months column to be blank.
Can I, going back to the example, well, you can leave it here too, but
yep.
if they were, I would assume most of the counties will use 1A because I believe that's what the software provider is kind of recommending. If they use 1A on line 14, 15 would be blank. Is 2C still applicable for line 16, or would they use something different?
Nope, 2C is still applicable. So in all of these examples, the line 16 code will be the same, even if you are using 1A.
Okay. Thank you.
Good question. Okay, for example 2, same type of person, but rather than accepting the coverage, they waive coverage. My assumption when I built this was that we're using 2H, that's probably the most common that we see for most employers is basing that on the federal, or I'm sorry, on the rate of pay safe harbor. So that's looking at their hourly rate and making the determination. If most of the counties are using 1A for their offer of coverage code, then it'd be more common that you'd be using the safe harbor for the federal poverty line. So the alternative here would apply for most of the counties of using 2G, which says the coverage offered was affordable using the federal poverty line safe harbor. So there is kind of a strength of safe harbors. If they accept your coverage, then you should use 2C. It gets precedence over the others. So the only time when you would be using this 2G, this federal poverty line safe harbor, or 2H, or even 2F, which is the W-2 version, is if somebody has waived your coverage and you're still safe from penalty because it's affordable based on the monthly premiums and potentially the actual pay of the employee. And then example 3, I wanted to show an example. What if the amount that we're charging is high enough that employee does not have affordable coverage? So in the example, I show it with a $200 lowest monthly cost plan. That's probably not realistic for those that are on the call. But if you did have a higher cost plan as your lowest cost plan, this is what it would look like. We get down to line 16. In this case, they did not accept the coverage, so we can't use code 2C, and it wasn't affordable, so we can't use one of those affordability safe harbors. So we're going to leave line 16 blank. And anytime that we see a blank in line 16, we just want to kind of keep in mind that means that there's some risk of penalty and get our arms around that. In this case, you are offering coverage to this person, so it's not the kind of penalty here that counts towards that potential sledgehammer penalty, or that penalty that says you didn't offer coverage to enough people. This person here would be the kind of person who would only cause any penalty for the county if they actually went out and got subsidized insurance. So this is probably not the cases where you're going to see penalties come because premium levels are typically lower than this. The cases where counties are going to see any potential penalty is maybe they have a part-time person who on occasion works enough hours to be considered full-time, or they're in a class of employee that doesn't get offered coverage, but they qualify as full-time under one of those methods we talked about, and they're just not offered coverage. So that's more common to be the case of when a county could get penalized than this particular case. But the main thing I like to point out is anytime line 16 is blank on one of these 1095Cs, that means there's some risk of penalty to the employer. All right, example 4, these are your new hires. So the common codes are going to be that 1E that we talked about, or 1A that says that coverage was offered to the entire household. And both of those say that piece. And we see that here in this case. We have an employee hired in April who has a first of the month after 30 days they get coverage, so they get coverage beginning in June. So we have 1E shown here. And Brad, as you mentioned, code 1A is probably more common. The months prior to being offered coverage, we're using code 1H, and that says no offer of coverage was made. Those are really the only two codes that are going to get used for most employers. 1H saying that no offer of coverage is made, and then whatever code applies best to their plan, 1E or 1A. The safe harbor codes, there's going to be more that are commonly used to the employer than the offer coverage codes on line 14. So in this case, line 16, remember this person was hired in April, so they were not employed by the employer in January, February, March. So we're using code 2A that says that they were not an employee in those months. And then they were not offered coverage until June, so we're going to use code 2D for May and June that says that they were in a limited non-assessment period. And we'll pause there for a second, because in order to say that you offered coverage, you need to offer coverage for every single day of the month as an employer. So even if you offer coverage on day one, so this person is hired in April, what does April look like for this particular employee, even if they get coverage on their first day of employment? Well, if they're offered, or if their start date was April 1st, then you would go ahead and use either code 1E or 1A in April for line 14, and then the code you use in April under that situation will apply to somebody who's actually been offered coverage. But if they were hired April 2nd or any other day in April, then the correct code to use for that situation is 1H, saying that they were not offered coverage. So there's kind of a disconnect because they were offered coverage for part of the month, but in order to say that they were offered coverage from the employer reporting side of things, that they need to be offered coverage for every single day. So if your coverage begins first day of employment and they started in April, most of the time you're still going to use code 1H under that situation, unless they happen to be hired on the first of the month. Code 2D is what's available for that situation when somebody starts mid-month like that. So even if they were offered coverage on the first day of employment and you needed to use code 1H in line 14, you'd still have code 2D available to you. And then the fact that you have a safe harbor code means that you're safe from penalty. So the example on the screen is set up for first of the month after 30 days. For some cases, though, where they get coverage on the first day of employment, I wanted to kind of talk through what April and May would look like that was different. And so then you'll see beginning in June, if they enroll and take the coverage, we would start using code 2C. Again, if you're offered coverage on the first day of employment, most of the time for May you'd be using 2C, but for April you'd still use that 2D unless it was hired on the first. And then our safe harbor code, if they waive coverage, you wouldn't be using 2C. You'd probably be using 2G or 2H or 2F. And so the example I have here shows it with code 2H. Right. Then we get to the terminating employee or potentially the retiring employee. And there are two examples here for this one. The first example is going to be the more common. This is for employers who, upon termination, allow the coverage to go through the end of the month of termination. So if somebody leaves in August, then they get coverage all the way through August. And that's probably the more common situation. The other alternative is that their coverage also terminates on their last day of work, and they get offered COBRA sometime mid-month. And so that's why there's example 5A and 5B. This is a clarification to some of the interpretations that were out there during 2015. And the reason is there was the 2014 forms, which were optional. The 2015 draft actually had a different method for how to handle employees who accepted COBRA or were on a retiree plan. And then beginning with the actual 2015 forms, they clarified how this should look. So for this particular employee, they were on the plan while they were employed. So all the way through August, we're showing that they were offered coverage and that they had coverage by using that code 2C. Once they are no longer employed, and coverage goes until the end of August in this case, beginning in September, we're now going to show code 1H. And we would do this even if they stayed on the plan as a non-employee. So if they stayed on the plan as a retiree or if they stayed on the plan as a COBRA participant, we're still going to show code 1H saying that no offer of coverage was made. And that's just one of the disconnects of what this form is trying to accomplish. This form is looking at what your obligations are as an employer from the employer mandate side of things. This particular person would no longer be your obligation from an employer mandate or a cost-sharing provision side of things. So you're reporting this as saying 1H, that no offer of coverage is made, even though you know that they had coverage that was through you as the employer, as a non-employee. The safe harbor code here to use is 2A that says they were not employed during the month. So this is a little bit arbitrary as to why to do it this way. but this is the method the IRS tells us to use. Interestingly, if you were a self-insured employer, there's a part 3 of this form of the 1095-C that you won't have to complete, but self-insured employers do. And this is probably one of the biggest disconnects that we have to walk through employers with, because on part 3 of that form, they still select that person had coverage for those same months when they were on COBRA or on the plan as a retiree. And the reason for that is part 3 is really coming at it from a different point of view. Part 3 is there for that individual so that they can show the IRS they had coverage for months during the year. So think of it as part 2. These codes, these 1 series codes and these 2 series codes are all about the employer and whether the employer can get penalized by the IRS. Part 3 is all about the employee and whether the employee had coverage and can avoid that individual mandate penalty. So since both the employer and the individual have a mandate as part of the Affordable Care Act, they needed a form that could handle both, and that's why that self-insured portion is out there, to allow employers who are self-insured to have just one form that they can provide everything to the employee, rather than need to fill out 2 forms like your employees receive. They receive a 1095-C from you, the employer, a 1095-B from ISAC, the provider, and that gets them the combined information, whereas a self-insured employer would just be sending out one form that would kind of have both of those components to it.
All right, Michael, before you move on, sorry.
Yep.
In this instance, for example, 5A, the counties usually, let's say they take out premiums for September in August. So let's say an employee ended employment in August, but he basically had already paid his premiums for September. What codes would you use there in September?
But so they'll have coverage on, but it's not really a true COBRA situation.
Right. So he's already paid his premiums for September, but he ended employment in August. So he's not an employee in September, but
I would still use the coding as shown here, because it's still after termination, and that particular employee was not employed any month or any day during the month. So the main thing for the employer side is you want to show that you have a safe harbor code. So I would still show it the way it is here for that situation.
Okay. All right,
you probably have latitude. It's probably okay to do it either way and just show September with another extension, just like August was. So you might talk to your technology provider as well if you're using one for these forms. But I think either option is available to you. To me, the cleanest would be to almost treat that like a COBRA situation, even though it's not truly COBRA, since they're not your employee any day of the month. We know Code 2A will work.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and then example 5B, it's the same as the last example. It just has the coverage terminating and COBRA being offered on that last day of the month. Now, Brad, this is probably not common or maybe not even existent for this group. Well, I'll go ahead and go through it even if it may not apply. So the differences here are August, that month of termination, we're going to use code 1H. That is because in order for the employer to say they offer coverage, they need to do so for every day of the month. And since that didn't happen, 1H is the correct code to be used here that says no offer of coverage was made. But for line 16, we would still have a code available to us, and that would be code 2B, that says that is not a full-time employee for the month. And that may or may not be the case. This person may or may not have had enough hours to be considered full-time for that month. But as part of the definition, and the reason I put the wording in here, is that it's prescribed that this is the code to use in this situation, where somebody loses coverage solely because of termination. And had they stayed an employee, they would have had coverage for the entire month. There is one typo on this page. In this situation, column 15, or line 15 under August should be blank. If code 1H is a code that does not allow line 15 to be used. So the line 15 should be blank in the example here.
Yeah, I would assume that if an employee left employment during the month, they'd be covered at least through the end. So.
Yeah, I don't think that's probably going to be a common example.
Right.
And then example 6 won't apply to this group either. This is for self-insured employees only, but it is something that was clarified, and maybe we got a little bit more information on as we moved through last year. So I wanted to include it because a lot of times other employers are talking, or employers are talking to each other, and if you hear about code 1G and them using it, don't worry. That is not something that applies to you. It's not something you're doing wrong because you haven't had to use this code. But what 1G is for an employee or somebody who is covered, but not an employee or a full-time employee during any month. So the most common case would be if you're self-insured and you have a retiree from a prior year, you have no employer mandate obligation to that employee. So Part 2 is not really needed for the IRS. But if you still want to provide the information to that employee about which months they were covered via a 1095-C, then Code 1G allows you to bypass Part 2 so that you can go ahead and fill out Part 3 with which employees or which month that employee or former employee was covered in and which dependents they potentially had that were covered. So it's really just a bypass to allow for the information needed for the individual mandate. This will not apply to anybody that is not self-insured. So just wanted it to be in here more for kind of more of a complete description of what the code looks like than something that will actually be needed for this particular group. So with that, those are my examples. That hits most of the cases that you'll have. You might have some part-time people who have some different examples. We did have a few of those in the prior seminar, so we could talk through those if you want offline or if you wanted to revisit. But for the most part, it's going to be pretty clean for this group with full-time employees who are offered coverage. You're going to have new hires and terminations throughout the year. So hopefully those examples will hit most of your cases. And with that, I guess we'll see if there are any other questions, or Brad, have you got anything else as we went through?
Yeah. Okay. So 2 more questions here. All right. Back to the discussion. If we use 1A on line 14, which I said most counties have been told by their software companies or vendors that that's kind of what they'll be using. This particular person said they were told that nothing would have to be in line 16.
In line 16?
16, yeah. So I know there would be nothing in line 15, but
right. I haven't seen that interpretation, and I would.
So
I would. I guess I would disagree with that interpretation, but you might go back and see if they have anything to back that piece up.
Okay.
It's very explicit about line 15.
Right. So. Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong, but line 14 is basically the code that basically says that you offered insurance to the employee. That's what's on line 14. Line 15 is the cost, and we said if you use 1A in line 14, you don't have to do 15. And line 16 is basically telling the IRS or whoever that offer or the coverage was either accepted or it was declined. In a roundabout way. That's
yeah, accepted or if declined, you have some reason to be safe. So,
right.
So the use of code 1A would certainly suggest that be the case. It's very explicit in line 15 in the instructions for line 15 that no code would that it should be left blank in the case of 1A. For line 16, the codes are completely silent on whether there's a connection with 1A in line 14. So I would say you should probably still use a code in line 16.
Right. I have not seen any examples or heard of anything where you would use line 14 and not use 16. So second question then, if you have a full-time employee who waives coverage for the first couple of months of employment, and then opted to take coverage after spouse's coverage changed, how do you code that? So they declined coverage at first, and then, you know, lost insurance, or her spouse's lost insurance, so then they want to come back on. How would you code that?
Okay. Yep, that's a great question. I'm going to go ahead and kind of treat this like we would a new hire. But those months prior, so say that the new offer of coverage happened for June, then if June is the first month that they are on coverage for the entire time, you would start using that code 2C in June under this case. But prior to them electing it, they were offered coverage. So January, February, March, April, and May should also have the code 1A or potentially the code 1E with the amount in here, because the offer of coverage was made. And since they declined the coverage, then you'd need to evaluate for January through May, was it an offer of coverage that was affordable? If it was, then you would use your safe harbor code here of either 2G or 2H or in some cases 2F. So for that employee, most of the time it would look like a 2G if you're using that federal poverty line, safe harbor, in January, February, March, April, and May. And then once they come on the plan, you start using code 2C. And for the entire year, the offer of coverage was made, so you would use code 1E for the rest. Now, if this was a new hire, you might have other months that use the 2A and the 2D, and then you could use up to 4 codes for that particular person for safe harbor codes if they were a new hire who declined coverage for the first few months and then picked it up later. So that would kind of add a lot of different codes being used, but it would be the same principles of kind of piecing together.
Okay. Another one has come in. On example 1, you used $100 for the employee contribution. Do you always just use the average premium for the year unless you fill in each month?
No. Yeah. In the first part of the example 1, it was $100 for the entire year was what I was assuming. If the premium did change during the year, then that's what the alternative line is trying to show. So I probably should have picked an example that did not average out to 100. That probably would have been a little bit less confusing.
And you would use the actual premium amount, not the average, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. One more here. Is 1A better to use than 1E? I used 1E last year and feel very comfortable with this code for all of my regular full-time employees enrolled in health insurance. I'm confused with the differences between the two codes.
Yep. No, I would say it's not a matter of better. I agree. 1E it seems simple enough to use. I kind of like having the information about the lowest cost single plan on there, even if it happens to be something like $0. And there's no problem with using this what we call that general method of using 1E with the actual premium amount in there. 1A just gives the advantage of leaving line 15 blank. I've noticed that especially software providers love that. They love being able to leave line 15 blank. So 1A is probably common, but it's certainly not required. And if you just use 1E, then you don't have to worry about box A on line 14 or line 22 of the 1094C. And so in the end, they both accomplish the same thing. I wouldn't say one's better than the other. Just maybe more moving parts depending on which one you choose. If you're comfortable with 1E, feel free to go ahead and use it.
All right. That is all I have for questions. So we'll just go ahead and wrap it up. If you have questions and didn't get them submitted in time, feel free to email myself. Molly and I can handle answering some questions, and if I don't know, I will turn to Michael at Silverstone. Feel free to give us a call if that works for you as well. So I appreciate your time today, and we'll go with that, have a good afternoon.
All right. Thank you very much, Brad.
Thank you.